Splash 3. Her voice was calm, almost bored, and First Lieutenant Dax Sawyer sat frozen in the cockpit, humiliated in front of 30 pilots by a woman in civilian clothes he'd mocked an hour earlier. Then he saw the registry. Classified detachment. No name he recognized. Only a call sign whispered in rumors nobody dared confirm. Charon, the ferryman of the dead. She wasn't a contractor. She wasn't a desk clerk taking notes in the corner. She was the most lethal pilot on the base, and she'd requested him, personally, for a mission that didn't officially exist. Because 9 years ago, her father died in a training accident that never added up, and somewhere in the wreckage of a satellite crashing into frozen ocean waters, the truth was still buried. She was done waiting, and she was about to drag Dax straight into the fire with her. The Virginia sky over Blackridge Air Force Base hung low and gray that morning, the kind of humid, bruised sky that pressed down on the tarmac like a held breath. Fog curled off the runway in thin ribbons, catching the first amber light of dawn, and somewhere beyond the perimeter fence a hawk circled once, twice, then vanished into the tree line as if it, too, wanted no part of what was coming. Inside Hangar 9, in a windowless briefing room built for men who did not believe in fear, First Lieutenant Dax Sawyer sat with his boots crossed at the ankle, and his arms folded over his chest like a king, surveying a kingdom he had not yet earned. He was 26 years old. He had the kind of face that made recruiting posters obsolete: square jaw, sun-streaked hair cropped high and tight, a smile that arrived a half-second before anyone had said anything funny. He wore his confidence the way other men wore cologne. Too much of it, sprayed on so thick you could smell it from across the room. And this morning, Dax Sawyer smelled like a man who had already won. He had flown the F-16 out of Colby Air Force Base for 3 years before the transition orders came through. 3 years of chewing up simulated kill counts. 3 years of instructors muttering his name like a rumor they weren't sure they believed yet. When the Air Force selected him for the F-22 Raptor, the undisputed apex predator of American air power, Dax hadn't treated it like an honor. He'd treated it like a formality. Beside him, Lieutenant Milo Danvers reviewed telemetry data from that morning's training sortie, his brow furrowed, his coffee long gone cold in a paper cup at his elbow. Milo was the kind of wingman who noticed things, who read a room the way other men read weather. And right now, the room felt wrong to him in a way he couldn't quite name. "You should have seen it, Milo." Dax's voice was pitched low, but not low enough, carrying easily over the murmur of 30 other pilots, settling into their chairs. "I had Colonel Reyes dead in my sights before he even knew I'd rolled out. Pulled a high yo-yo, dumped my speed, dropped straight into his 6. Simulated Fox 2 before his radar warning receiver even finished screaming." Milo didn't look up from his tablet. "Keep it down, Dax. Shaw's got ears like a bat. Let him hear." Dax ran a hand through his hair unbothered. "Results speak for themselves. If you can't dogfight in a Raptor, you shouldn't be flying one. Stealth's a crutch for guys who forgot how to actually fight." At the front of the room, Colonel Everett Shaw, callsign Anvil, 40 years of flight hours carved into the lines of his face like rings in old oak, tapped the microphone once. The sound cracked through the room like a rifle shot, and 30 pilots fell instantly silent. "Listen up." Shaw's voice was gravel dragged over concrete. "Today we're reviewing advanced beyond visual range engagement protocols against simulated 5th-generation adversary aircraft. Your stealth profile is your primary weapon, but if you push too deep into an enemy's sensor envelope without discipline, you will die. And some of you." His eyes moved slowly across the room, deliberate, unhurried, embarrassed yourselves in this morning's telemetry. Dax smirked and adjusted his posture into something even more relaxed, because he knew the colonel wasn't talking about him. It was in that small, self-satisfied pause that his eyes drifted, almost by accident, toward row 4, and stopped. She sat dead center, and she stood out precisely because she did not try to. Amid a sea of dark green flight suits and gleaming silver wings, she wore faded civilian jeans and a plain olive fleece with no rank, no name tape, no squadron patch. Her hair, dark, almost black in the fluorescent light, was pulled back into a severe utilitarian knot. She was not watching the projector. She was not watching Colonel Shaw. She was writing, slowly and without urgency, in a battered black notebook with a cheap plastic pen, and something about the stillness of her posture made the whole room feel, to Dax, faintly ridiculous by comparison. She looked bored. Not nervous bored, not out of her depth bored, unimpressed bored. The particular boredom of someone who had already seen the ending of a movie. Everyone else was still watching for the first time. Dax leaned toward Milo, nodding at her with his chin. "Who's the librarian?" Milo squinted. "No idea. Walked in behind Shaw. Contractor, probably. Lockheed rep, maybe. She's taking notes like it's a grocery list." Dax's voice dropped, curdling at the edges into something meaner. "Doesn't she know where she's sitting? This room's got the deadliest pilots on the East Coast in it, and she's doodling in a notebook like she's got somewhere better to be." Milo said nothing. Milo had learned, 3 years ago, exactly when saying nothing was the wiser move. Colonel Shaw advanced the slide. A tactical map bloomed across the projector screen, overlapping rings of red and blue, threat envelopes layered like the rings of a target. "Scenario," Shaw announced. "You're a 2-ship Raptor element pushing into contested airspace. AWACS goes dark from heavy jamming. Passive sensors detect 2 thermal contacts, 30 miles out, closing fast, above you at 40,000 feet. Radar signature consistent with 5th-generation adversary interceptors. You're at 25,000. Blind. What's your immediate action?" Silence swallowed the room whole. It was a nightmare scenario, and every pilot present knew it. The Raptor lived and died by seizing first, killing first, and vanishing before the enemy ever registered the intrusion. Being pushed low, blind, beneath a faster and more maneuverable adversary that wasn't a fight. That was a funeral with extra steps. Dax saw his opening, and he took it without hesitation, without raising his hand, without waiting to be called on. "I'd pitch up and take the fight to them, Colonel." Shaw's gaze cut to him slowly, and something in the old man's expression, something patient, almost sorrowful, should have been warning enough. "Explain, Lieutenant." Dax stood. He liked standing. Standing meant every eye in the room had nowhere else to go. "Their radar cross-sections significantly larger from below than head-on," he said, warming to the sound of Hippo's uncertainty. "I initiate a steep high-G climb. Yes, I expose my belly, but I'm closing distance at supersonic speed while I do it. I light my active radar for exactly 2 seconds, long enough for a firing solution. Launch a volley in active mode. Dive back into ground clutter before they can react. I use their closure rate against them. They either bleed energy evading, or they eat a missile." A murmur rippled through the junior officers. It sounded bold. It sounded, to ears that had only ever fought in simulators against predictable AI, like something out of a movie trailer. Dax allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, and let his gaze drift down toward row 4 to see whether the board contractor had finally decided he was worth looking at. She had. Her pen had gone still on the page, and what looked back at him from those pale gray eyes was not admiration. It was not intimidation. It was the specific, weary pity of someone watching a child announce, with complete confidence, that 2 + 2 equaled potato. She shook her head. Once, almost imperceptibly. It landed on Dax like an open-handed slap. She actually just something hot and ugly climbed up the back of his neck. The murmuring pilots around him seemed to sense the shift in temperature. Because the room went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. Colonel Shaw hadn't missed it either. He leaned against the podium, arms folding slowly across his chest, the ghost of something that wasn't quite a smile tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Something wrong with the lieutenant's plan, ma'am?" The woman didn't flinch. She capped her pen with unhurried precision, set it down against the spine of her notebook, and leaned back in her chair like she had all the time in the world, and had spent most of it already deciding this conversation wasn't worth rushing. "It's a suicide run," she said. Her voice was quiet, raspy almost, utterly without heat. Here it comes, thought Dax, and he stepped forward into the aisle before he could stop himself, because his pride had already made the decision his brain hadn't caught up to yet. Excuse me? You heard me. It's a mathematically sound energy retention tactic. It's a mathematically sound way to die 12 seconds sooner than you would have otherwise. She didn't raise her voice to match his. She didn't need to. You're assuming their primary tracking method in a jamming heavy environment is radar. It won't be. They'll be running passive infrared search and track. The moment you pitch up and light your afterburners to climb, your engines throw a thermal bloom the size of a city block against cold upper atmosphere. You might as well fire a flare gun and paint a target on your own fuselage. That's Dax started. They don't need your radar lock, she went on, and her tone stayed level, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. They already have a passive IR track on your exhaust before you finish your climb. They fire downward. Gravity gives their missiles the kinematic edge. You're climbing bleeding speed against gravity the entire time. Your missiles arrive 5 seconds after theirs already have. You're dead. Your wingman's dead. And they use thrust vectoring to dodge whatever you managed to get off before you died. Your plan doesn't win the fight, Lieutenant. A pause, long enough to feel deliberate. It just gives them a nice fireworks show. The silence that followed was total. Nobody breathed. Somewhere near the back, a pilot's chair creaked, and the sound seemed impossibly loud. Milo stared very hard at the floor, wishing, with the entire force of his being, that he were anywhere else on the planet. Dax's jaw tightened. What made it unbearable, what made his ears burn and his hands curl into loose fists at his sides, was that every syllable of what she'd said was correct, and he knew it, and every pilot in that room knew it too. But pride is a stubborn animal, and Dax's had never once, in 26 years, agreed to lie down quietly. That's a lot of textbook theory. He sneered, gripping the back of the chair in front of him, using his height the way some men use a raised voice. Easy to run numbers from a cubicle. Different story when you're pulling 8 Gs in the dark with half a second to decide. I've logged over 1,000 hours in fighter aircraft. I know what a Raptor can do. Something flickered behind her gray eyes. Not anger. Something colder and more amused than anger. 1,000 hours. She repeated it softly, like turning over a coin to check if it was counterfeit. How quaint. Are you a pilot? Dax pushed, and his voice climbed, echoing off the concrete walls. Or do you just read the manuals? We're the ones who actually have to fly. Colonel Shaw straightened, one hand lifting. Lieutenant Sawyer, you're bordering on insubordination. Stand down. But the woman raised a hand of her own, and astonishingly, Shaw stopped talking. It's fine, Everett, she said. Everett. Not Colonel, not Sir. His call sign wasn't even his actual first name, tossed out casually, like something she'd earned the right to use a long time ago. The cold knot that had been forming in Dax's stomach for the last 90 seconds suddenly tightened into a fist. Wait. Who is she? Who is she that Shaw just stopped? Like a light switch. Like an order. But he was already too far out over the edge. And pride, that stubborn animal, doesn't know how to climb back once it's committed to the fall. You want to prove your theory? The words tumbled out of him before caution could catch them. Simulator bays are open. 4-dome network. Full tactical fidelity. Load your exact scenario. You against me. Let's see if your infrared lecture holds up with a real stick in your hand. Milo grabbed his sleeve. Yanked. Hard. Dax. Shut up. Sit down. Dax shook him off. No. I'm done letting desk theorists tell pilots how to fly. He looked back at her. Unless you're scared of throwing up in the centrifuge. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that the silence itself became a kind of pressure, pushing down on the room like the humidity outside. Then she closed her notebook, tucked it into the pocket of her fleece with the unhurried care of someone putting away something they intended to pick back up later, once this small inconvenience had been dealt with. She stood. She wasn't tall, 5'7", maybe, but there was something in the economy of her movement, nothing wasted, nothing performed, that made the air in the room feel suddenly thinner, the way it does at altitude. She looked past Dax entirely, toward the podium. "Colonel, do we have bay time?" Shaw looked at Dax, then at her, and the expression that crossed his weathered face as he looked back at Dax was not anger, and it was not amusement. It was pity. Profound and total. "Bays 3 and 4 are prepped, Captain," he said. "Floor's yours, Captain." The word landed in Dax's chest like a dropped stone. She's military, but no uniform, no deference to the base commander that a normal captain would show a colonel. She calls him by his first name, and he just let her have the room. What is she? She walked past him without a glance, and as she passed, he caught something faint and strange in the air, metallic, almost ozone-sharp. The particular scent that clung to people who spent more of their lives inside pressurized cockpits than they did on the ground. "Suit up, Lieutenant," she said over her shoulder, not slowing down, her raspy voice trailing behind her like smoke. "Guns and short range only. Let's make it a knife fight. I'd hate for you to blame your radar when you lose." "When," Dax noted distantly, walking on legs that had gone strangely numb. Not if. When. The tactical simulator facility at Blackridge sat inside a hangar the size of a cathedral. 4 massive white domes mounted on hydraulic legs like enormous mechanical insects. Inside each was a 1-to-1 replica of a Raptor cockpit, a visual system capable of rendering a seamless 360-degree sky, and hydraulics violent enough to simulate the crushing weight of high-G maneuvering. Dax sat in the cockpit of Bay 3, cinching his harness with hands that would not quite stop shaking, and told himself it was adrenaline. It's adrenaline. It's just adrenaline. You've flown 100 of these. You've won most of them. This is nothing. Except it doesn't feel like nothing. Except she called Shaw by his first name. Except she looked at your best tactic like it was something scraped off her boot. He shoved the thought down hard, the way he'd shoved down every uncomfortable thought his entire adult life with bravado, because bravado had never once let him down before. Through his headset, the sim operator's voice crackled. "Bay 3, comms check. Havoc's green." He gripped the side stick, and the molded plastic felt, for the first time in years, unfamiliar in his hand. "Bay 4, comms check, green." Her voice, even through digital compression, sounded utterly, infuriatingly relaxed. "All right, pilots." Colonel Shaw's voice from the control booth above. "Neutral merge 20,000 feet. Guns and Fox 2 only. Hard deck 5,000. Break it, you die. First to 3 kills wins." A pause. Fights on. The dome around Dax dissolved into open sky, cloudless and impossibly blue over jagged, snow-capped mountains that existed nowhere on any real map. 2 miles ahead, a black speck hung against the horizon. There she is. Here we go. He slammed the throttle to the stops. Full afterburner. The G-suit clenched around his legs like a fist as the simulator threw him into a violent climb, and he rolled hard right at the top, a classic defensive maneuver meant to force an overshoot if she came straight at him. He rolled out, scanning. The speck was gone, where his radar screen showed nothing. At merge range, she should have been sitting right on his scope, stealth or no stealth. Panic, thin and cold, threaded up through his chest. A shadow fell across his canopy. He craned his neck upward, and there she was inverted, less than 50 feet above him, so close he could make out the digitized rivets on her fuselage. She hadn't engaged him. She'd used his own aggressive brake to slide directly into his blind spot. And now she was simply sitting there, watching him, the way a hawk watches a field mouse decide which direction to run. Move, 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 move. He wrenched the stick left, kicked the rudder, tried to snap out of her line. Beep, 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 beep. The high, shrieking wail of an infrared lock filled his headset. Fox 2. Kill. Her voice. Quiet, almost bored. The dome flashed red. 14 seconds. He hadn't touched his trigger once. Reset, Shaw's voice said flatly. "Lucky trick," Dax muttered, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a trembling glove. "Let's see you do it twice." Fights on. This time he didn't play defense. He drove straight at her, meaning to merge hard and force a vertical scissors, the kind of brutal, sustained G-turning fight where raw aggression usually won. At the merge, he hauled the stick back, grunting against 8Gs, tracking her exhaust trail over his shoulder, expecting her to climb with him into the traditional fight. She didn't. She killed her forward airspeed almost to zero, used thrust vectoring in a way he'd only ever read about in classified theoretical manuals, throwing her jet into a violent, physics-defying stall that flipped her nose over tail like a falling leaf caught in a gust. He was doing 400 knots. She was suddenly doing 80. He blew past her before his brain had even finished registering what had happened. His radar warning receiver went berserk. She was behind him now, hanging in the air, nose pointed square at his engines. Brr! The heavy mechanical rattle of simulated cannon fire shook the dome. Red flash. 22 seconds. This isn't a dogfight, some small, clear part of Dax's mind observed, distant and strange, as if watching from outside his own body. This is an execution. Reset. No warmth in Shaw's voice now, just a kind of grim finality. Fights on. The third engagement dissolved into pure animal terror. Dax abandoned every ounce of aggression, dove for the deck, skimmed the mountain peaks at 1,000 miles an hour, jinking left and right through canyons that didn't exist anywhere on Earth, trying to hide inside the radar clutter of terrain he'd never flown. He couldn't find her, couldn't hear her. The sky was empty, silent, and somehow that silence was worse than any missile lock. "I lost her," he panted into the comms, voice cracking. "Where is she?" "Nothing." He banked hard around a jagged ridge, pulled the nose up to clear it. She was waiting, hovering just above the ridgeline, nose pitched down 30 degrees, in an ambush posture that violated every principle of energy management he'd ever been taught. She pulled the trigger. Red flash, splash 3. "End exercise," she said. Quiet, final, almost gentle, in a way that somehow made it crueler. The hydraulics hissed. The dome lowered. The canopy cracked open, and Dax sat frozen for a long moment in the sudden silence. His flight suit soaked through with cold sweat, his hands shaking too badly to unbuckle his own harness. 3 minutes. She dismantled me in 3 minutes. Everything I've ever thought about who I am. Gone. In 3 minutes. He climbed down on legs that didn't feel like his own and staggered to the master console between the bays where a young staff sergeant sat with wide, disbelieving eyes. "Pull the registry." Dax's voice came out hoarse. "Bay 4. Who's logged into Bay 4? The sergeant typed. The screen filled with green text, and it didn't list a training squadron. Didn't list any tactical wing Dax had ever heard of. Instead, a classified detachment code blinked at the top of the file. The kind of code that circulated only as rumor in the darkest corners of the officers' club, whispered by men who'd had one too many drinks and sworn everyone else to secrecy about it afterward. Beneath the code, 2 words: Marlowe Ashworth. Call sign: Charon. Charon, the ferryman of the dead. The one who rows the souls of the fallen across the river that no living thing was meant to cross. The blood left Dax's face in a single cold rush. Behind him, the heavy steel door of Bay 4 clanked open, boots on concrete. He turned slowly. She stood there, helmet dangling from one hand by its chin strap, looking exactly as she had in the briefing room, tired, unimpressed, entirely unbothered by what she had just done to him. "You fly like you read a book about it," she said softly. Her gray eyes held his without blinking. "If that had been real airspace today, Lieutenant, your mother would be folding a flag tomorrow." She turned and walked toward the exit, boot heels echoing off concrete in the vast, silent hangar. Dax watched her go, and something in his chest, something that had never once, in 26 years, cracked open now, and let in a cold he wasn't sure would ever entirely leave. The Blackridge Officers Club, on a normal Thursday, was a place of loud music and louder stories, of men and women in flight suits recounting the day's small victories with their hands, sketching invisible dogfights in the air over pitchers of beer. Tonight, First Lieutenant Dax Sawyer sat alone in the darkest corner booth, staring into a pint of beer gone flat and warm, as though it might, if he looked long enough, offer him some explanation for what had happened to him that afternoon. Word had traveled fast. Word always traveled fast on a base this size, and in a community this small, humiliation had a half-life measured in minutes, not hours. By the time the sun had gone down, every pilot in the wing knew that the Golden Boy Havoc, the untouchable, the one with the recruiting poster jaw and the 1,000 flight hours, had been taken apart by a stranger in civilian clothes in under 3 minutes. Milo slid into the booth across from him, setting down 2 fresh beers neither of them would drink. "You look like a man who watched his own dog get run over." Dax didn't touch the beer. He traced a line through the condensation on his glass, watching it bead and run, because it was easier than looking up. "Did you see the call sign, Milo?" "I heard." Milo's voice dropped lower, instinctively, the way voices dropped in rooms where certain names got mentioned. "Charon. Rumor mill's already spinning. Intel says she doesn't even show up in the standard personnel database. Files locked behind something above our clearance. You picked a fight with a ghost, man. She didn't just beat me." Dax's voice had lost every trace of its usual swagger, gone hollow, stripped down to something raw. "She played with me. That stall maneuver that's not standard flight envelope. You override the control laws to pull something like that. You do that in a real jet, you risk an unrecoverable flat spin. She flew like she didn't care if she died in it." Before Milo could answer, the heavy wooden doors of the club swung open, and the chatter in the room dropped by several notches all at once. Colonel Everett Shaw didn't head for the bar. His eyes swept the room, landed on Dax's booth, and he walked straight over without breaking stride. "Lieutenant Sawyer, my office. 5 minutes." He was gone again before Dax could respond, the door swinging shut behind him. Grounded, Dax thought, standing on legs that still hadn't fully recovered their strength. Or worse, cargo planes in Alaska. Or worse than that. He gave Milo a grim nod and walked out into the thick Virginia night, the humidity pressing against him like something with weight and intention. The squadron command building was lit in the stark, unforgiving way of all military buildings after dark fluorescent light, with no shadows to soften it, no warmth to blunt the edges of whatever was about to happen. Dax stepped into the commander's office and snapped to attention out of pure muscle memory, because his brain had stopped offering useful instructions somewhere around the 3rd simulated missile lock. Colonel Shaw sat behind a heavy oak desk, a thick manila folder in front of him, stamped in bold red letters across the top. "No foreign top secret sensitive compartmented information. At ease, Havoc." Shaw's voice had gone quiet in a way Dax had never heard from him. "Close the door." Dax closed it. Stood at parade rest. "Sir, if this is about the sim bay, shut up and listen." Dax shut up. Shaw tapped the folder without opening it, his eyes fixed on some point in the middle distance, somewhere Dax couldn't follow. "Do you know what it takes to earn a call sign like Charon in this Air Force, Lieutenant?" "No, sir. You don't earn it shooting down simulated targets in a dome." Shaw leaned back, the old leather chair creaking under him. 9 years ago, this country lost a pilot in a classified engagement that officially never happened, over airspace that officially doesn't exist on any map you're cleared to see. The pilot who survived that night went on to fly missions. This base doesn't have the clearance to acknowledge exist. She shot down more hostile aircraft in the dark, over water, with no support and no extraction guarantee, than any pilot currently serving in this wing. She doesn't fly for medals, because there aren't any medals for missions that never happened. She flies because someone has to do the math nobody else is willing to do, in places where the rules of engagement are written in blood instead of ink. He paused. "Let it sit. She thought your little display in the briefing room was cute. Why is she here, sir?" Dax's voice came out smaller than he intended. "If she's that deep in the black world, why's she sitting in a standard tactical briefing at Blackridge?" Shaw sighed a long, heavy sound and opened the folder. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk without ceremony. "Because, Lieutenant, the ghosts occasionally need a warm body." His eyes came up, and there was something almost sympathetic in them now, buried under decades of not letting himself feel sympathy for very much. "And unfortunately for you, she specifically requested the most aggressively predictable pilot in my squadron." Dax looked down at the paper. It was a transfer order. His name was on it. "Pack your bags, Havoc." Shaw's voice hardened back into steel. "You're detached from this wing, effective immediately. You belong to Karen now. The drive back to his quarters passed in a blur. Dax couldn't fully account for afterward. He remembered the humidity. He remembered the sound of his own boots on gravel. He didn't remember much else because his mind kept circling back to one detail, snagging on it the way a fingernail snags on a splinter. She requested me, by name. Why me? Out of every pilot on this base, why me? He didn't sleep that night. He lay on top of his bunk in the dark, staring at a ceiling he couldn't see, running the simulator fight over and over in his head like a film reel stuck on repeat, searching for the moment where he could have done anything differently. He never found it. There hadn't been a moment. There had only ever been her, 3 steps ahead, waiting. 2 buildings over, in a Spartan officer's quarters that contained almost nothing personal, no photographs on the walls, no mementos on the shelves, nothing that spoke of a life lived outside a cockpit. Captain Marlowe Ashworth sat on the edge of her bed with a small metal box open on her lap. The room was dark except for a single desk lamp, its light pooling in a tight circle that didn't quite reach the corners. Inside the box, a folded American flag, triangled with military precision. A set of dog tags, the metal gone dull with age, the chain slightly tarnished. A photograph, its edges soft and worn from 9 years of handling, showing a man in a flight suit, standing in front of an aircraft that didn't officially exist, grinning at the camera like he had every reason in the world to believe he'd live forever. Julian Ashworth. The tags read, call sign, Spectre. Marlowe held them without looking at them. The way you hold something you know by touch alone, something your fingers had long since memorized so your eyes wouldn't have to. 9 years, she thought. 9 years and the story still doesn't add up. Training accident, mechanical failure, classified, no further details available to family. 9 years of the same 3 sentences, typed on the same government letterhead, and not one word of it has ever made sense. You didn't die in a training accident, Dad. You were the best stick I've ever seen, and men like you don't die to a mechanical failure that conveniently erased every scrap of telemetry data along with you. Someone erased it. Someone made sure there was nothing left to find, and I am going to find it anyway. She closed the box gently, the way you close something you're not ready to put fully away. Set it on the small shelf beside her bunk, beneath a stack of files she wasn't cleared to have, but had acquired regardless, through channels she'd built slowly, carefully, over the better part of 3 years, 1 favor and 1 debt and 1 late-night conversation at a time. She'd requested Dax Sawyer's transfer for a reason that had nothing to do with punishing an arrogant lieutenant for running his mouth in a briefing room, though she wouldn't have minded that outcome either. His previous squadron, the one he'd flown F-16s out of before his transition had, 9 years ago, shared a runway rotation with the unit her father had disappeared from. Overlapping personnel, overlapping maintenance crews, a dozen names that might, if she pulled the right thread, led somewhere she hadn't yet been able to reach. He doesn't know anything. Probably. He was 17 when it happened, still finishing high school somewhere in Ohio. But his squadron's records might. And now his squadron's records are attached to me. She lay back on the thin mattress, staring at the same kind of ceiling. Dax was staring at 2 buildings away, though for entirely different reasons, and let the silence of the room settle over her like something familiar, something almost comfortable, in the way old grief becomes comfortable, worn smooth at the edges from 9 years of handling. Soon, she told the dark, I'm close. I can feel it. I just need 1 more piece. She didn't yet know how right she was or how much that 1 more piece would cost her. Morning came gray and close again, the humidity refusing to break, and Dax reported to a briefing facility he'd never had clearance to enter before, carrying a single duffel bag and a headache that had nothing to do with the beer he hadn't finished the night before. The building sat on the far edge of Blackridge, unmarked, its windows blacked out, its parking lot conspicuously empty of the kind of casual foot traffic that moved through the rest of the base. A young airman checked his credentials against a list at the door with the careful, unsmiling thoroughness of someone who had been trained to assume everyone was lying until proven otherwise. Inside, the corridors were narrow, the lighting dim, the air carrying that particular hush of buildings where important quiet things happened behind closed doors. He found her waiting in a small briefing room, alone, standing at a wall-mounted screen currently dark. She'd traded the civilian fleece for a sterile black flight suit, stripped of every patch and name tape, only a subdued gray rank insignia on the shoulder, marking her as a captain to anyone who bothered to look closely. Lieutenant. She didn't turn around. You're early. Couldn't sleep, ma'am. Good. Something in her voice not quite approval, but close to it. Neither could I. She turned, finally, and studied him for a long moment with those pale gray eyes. The same eyes that had watched him lose 3 simulated dogfights in under 3 minutes the day before. Whatever she was looking for, he couldn't tell if she found it. You want to know why you're here, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am, you will. She turned back to the dark screen, tapped a code into a panel beside it, and the display flickered to life, resolving into a high-resolution map of a coastline Dax didn't recognize, jagged and gray, wrapped in swirling weather patterns that looked cold even rendered in pixels. Sit down, Lieutenant, Marlowe said quietly. This is where it stops being a game. Dax sat. Outside, the fog over Blackridge had finally begun to lift, burning off under a sun that hadn't yet decided whether it wanted to shine. But in the small, windowless room where Marlowe Ashworth stood in front of a map that would, within days, redraw the entire shape of both their lives, no light reached at all, only the cold blue glow of the screen, and the quiet, patient wait of 9 years of unanswered questions finally beginning, very slowly, to move. She reached for a folder on the table, thick and stamped in the same bold red letters that had haunted Dax's sleep the night before, and set it down between them without opening it yet. Before we start, she said, I want you to understand something. I didn't pull your transfer because I liked how you flew. I pulled it because your old squadron sat on the same flight line as a unit that doesn't exist anymore, a unit my father flew for. 9 years ago, he went down on a mission the Air Force has spent 9 years telling me was a training accident. Her voice didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't do any of the things a voice was supposed to do when it said words like that. It stayed level, precise, almost clinical, and somehow that made it land harder than if she'd shouted. I don't believe them. I haven't believed them in years. And somewhere in the paperwork attached to your old wing, there's a piece of what actually happened that I haven't been able to reach yet. Dax sat very still, absorbing this, feeling the ground shift slightly beneath a conversation that had started 12 hours ago as a simple humiliation and was now becoming something else entirely. I don't know anything about that, ma'am, he said carefully. I was in high school when... I know. Something almost gentle crossed her face there and gone in an instant. You don't have the answer, but you're going to help me find who does. And in exchange, I'm going to turn you into the kind of pilot who doesn't get himself killed doing something stupid and brave in a war. Nobody's supposed to know is happening. She opened the folder at last. This is Operation Broken Mirror, she said, and it starts in 4 hours. Dax leaned forward, and for the first time since the moment her pen had gone, still in the briefing room, he found himself hoping with a desperate, unfamiliar sincerity that he would prove himself worthy of whatever she saw when she looked at him. He didn't yet know how much that hope would cost either of them before the truth finally surfaced from 9 years beneath the ice. Outside, the Virginia fog thinned to nothing, and the sun at last decided to shine. The SIF door sealed behind Dax with a sound like a held breath finally released. 3 inches of steel, copper mesh in the walls. A silence so complete, it felt less like an absence of noise and more like a physical weight pressing against his eardrums. He did not know rooms like this existed on a base he'd called home for 6 months, which told him everything he needed to know about how small his world had actually been until yesterday. Marlowe stood at the head of a glowing tactical table, the map beneath her hands rendered in cold blue light. She hadn't looked up when he entered. She didn't look up now. Sit, she said. He sat. Because when Charon told you to sit, you sat. He'd learned that much in 14 seconds inside a simulator dome, and the lesson had stuck. The door hissed again. 2 men in dark suits entered first, silent, unreadable, the kind of men who existed in rooms like this, the way furniture existed, and behind them, a third man, tall, silver-haired, a gray suit that fit too well for a man who claimed by his badge to be a civilian program director. His smile arrived early and stayed too long, the way certain smiles do when a man has learned that charm is a tool and not a feeling. Captain Ashworth. His voice was warm, practiced warm, the kind of warm that came from years of boardrooms and budget hearings, not cockpits. Punctual as always. Director Kessler. Marlowe's voice didn't change, didn't warm, didn't cool either. It simply existed, flat and unbothered, the way it had existed in the briefing room the day before, when she'd dismantled Dax's entire theory of himself in under a minute. This is Lieutenant Sawyer, my asset for Broken Mirror. Kessler's eyes moved to Dax, and something in them assessed him the way a man assesses livestock at Okjog. Practical, already moving on. The bait. Kessler said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse. Good. Loud, I'm told, sir. Dax's voice came out steadier than he felt. Don't be offended, Lieutenant. Kessler's smile widened a fraction. Loud has value. Loud has saved more lives in this program than quiet ever has. Quiet just tends to get the credit. Marlowe's jaw moved. Barely. A muscle tightening and releasing so fast Dax almost missed it. Filed that away, he thought. Whatever that was. File it. Kessler settled into a chair at the head of the table, like a man taking his rightful seat in a boardroom, and the 2 suited men stationed themselves at the walls, arms crossed, faces blank. 48 hours ago, Kessler began, tapping the glowing table. An experimental low-orbit surveillance platform suffered a catastrophic deorbit event. The map zoomed, resolving into a jagged, storm-wrapped chain of islands somewhere in cold, gray water that existed on no map Dax had clearance to name. It came down here, an unnamed atoll, technically international waters. Practically speaking, close enough to a hostile state's air defense zone that they consider it theirs. A red dot bloomed on the screen, pulsing slowly. The satellite's core memory drive survived re-entry. Kessler's voice dropped into the register of a man reciting numbers he found genuinely thrilling. 6 months of raw optical and signals intelligence, naval shipyards, missile test corridors, command infrastructure. If it falls into the wrong hands, we lose every asset that platform was watching. If we retrieve it, we're a decade ahead of anyone who thinks they're still hiding. One of the suited men stepped forward, sliding a tablet across the table. Satellite imagery confirms a private security contractor deniable, foreign flagged. No official state affiliation has already dispatched an icebreaker to the site. Salvage crews on the ice now, estimated 4 hours, until they extract the drive. So we bomb it, Dax said, before he could stop himself. Strike package. B2. Problem solved. Kessler's smile turned indulgent, the way a teacher's smile turns indulgent for a student who's given the obvious wrong answer with real conviction. If a marked American aircraft strikes a foreign-flagged vessel in contested waters, Lieutenant, we no longer have a salvage problem. We have an international incident with a body count and a flag on it. He leaned back. We need something quieter, something deniable, a scalpel, not a hammer. Marlowe's fingers moved across the table, and the display shifted, the map tilting to show the airspace above the atoll. 2 red rings bloomed outward from a pair of aircraft icons circling at high altitude. Hostile air defense is running a 2-ship patrol of Kestrel pattern interceptors, she said. Heavy, fast, thrust-vectored. Officially a training exercise, actually, cover for the salvage operation on the ground. Her eyes lifted, finding Dax's across the table for the first time since the briefing began. We push in 2 Raptors, sanitized, no markings, out of Frostgate, wave-top ingress, under their radar horizon. I carry 2 precision munitions. I pop up, laze the wreck site, drop, and we're gone before they finish reacting. Dax studied the map, and something didn't sit right, because he'd flown enough missions in enough simulators to know when a plan had a hole in it. And this one had a hole shaped exactly like the moment her weapons bay doors opened. The second your bay doors crack, he said slowly, your stealth profile's compromised. Even half a second's exposure, their radar catches it. They'll have a firing solution before your bombs even hit the ice. Marlowe held his gaze. Something almost like approval flickered behind those pale gray eyes. There, and gone so fast he might have imagined it. Correct. So what stops them from painting you the second you pop up? She didn't answer right away. She let the silence stretch, the way she'd let silence stretch in the briefing room. Because silence, Dax was starting to understand, was one of her weapons too. You do, she said. The words landed like a dropped stone in still water. You'll fly external tanks, radar reflectors bolted to the airframe. You'll light up on their scopes like a Christmas tree the second you cross into their envelope. Her voice stayed level, clinical, the voice of a surgeon describing an incision. You're going to fly in exactly the way you described in that briefing room yesterday. Pitch up. Light your afterburners. Blast your active radar. Scream at them like a hotshot who thinks he owns the sky. You want me to be a decoy? His voice came out flatter than he intended. I want you to be the loudest, most aggressive, most brilliantly irritating target in that airspace, Marlowe corrected. While they're busy swatting the obnoxious American fly, I slip underneath, drop the payload, and vanish. And there it was. She didn't choose me because I'm good, Dax thought, and the realization arrived with a strange, hollow clarity, like a bell tolling somewhere far off. She chose me because I'm exactly as arrogant and predictable as she needs me to be. My ego isn't a flaw in her plan. It's the plan. They'll fire on me, he said quietly. Yes. No hesitation. No softening. They will. And if I get hit, Kessler answered before Marlowe could, his voice smooth, almost gentle, in the way certain kinds of cruelty learn to sound gentle after enough repetition. Then you didn't exist, Lieutenant. He said it the way another man might say, then it's raining. Sanitized aircraft. No markings. No transponder. Your service record gets quietly amended. Your family receives a letter about a training accident over the Pacific. It's not personal. It's simply how deniable operations work. Training accident. The words hit Dax sideways, glancing off something he didn't understand yet, but he saw Marlowe's hand still on the table. Just for a heartbeat. Just long enough that if he hadn't already spent the last day learning to watch her for the smallest tells, he would have missed it entirely. She flinched. Why did she flinch? He didn't ask. Some instinct, newer than yesterday but already sharpening fast, told him this wasn't the room to ask it in. Kessler stood, buttoning his jacket, with the unhurried satisfaction of a man closing a deal he'd already won. Wheels up from Frostgate in 6 hours. He nodded once at Marlowe, once more briefly at Dax. Good hunting, Captain. He left. The suited men followed. The heavy door sealed behind them with the same held-breath hiss it had made when Dax entered, and for a long moment the SIF held only the two of them, and the cold blue glow of a map that hadn't stopped pulsing. Captain Dax's voice was quiet now. Careful. Back there. When he said training accident, we have 6 hours. Marlowe's tone snapped shut like a door. You're going to spend every one of them learning to fly a maneuver that's going to keep you alive tonight. Questions about my personal history are not on the syllabus. Okay, Dax thought. Okay. Noted. File that away too. But something in the set of her shoulders, as she turned back toward the table, told him the door hadn't shut, because his question didn't matter. It had shut because it mattered too much. The simulator domes at Frostgate stood in a hangar that felt, to Dax, like a smaller, colder cousin of the one at Blackridge. Same hydraulic legs, same spherical white shells, but the air outside carried an edge that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with what they were about to do in it. Marlowe put him through the stall vector maneuver 11 times. 11. By the 4th attempt, his hands had stopped shaking from adrenaline and started shaking from exhaustion. By the 7th, he'd stopped cursing under his breath every time the simulated jet flipped tail over nose and threw his stomach somewhere up near his sternum. By the 11th, something clicked. Not understanding exactly. Something closer to muscle memory finally agreeing to trust a physics that felt, every single time, like it shouldn't work. Again, Marlowe's voice said through the comms, flat, unmoved by his ragged breathing. I got it that time. You got it once. A pause. Again. Because once isn't a skill, he told himself, gripping the stick with hands gone slick inside his gloves. Once is luck. And luck doesn't keep you alive at 40,000 feet with a missile climbing up your tailpipe. Which means she's not being cruel. Except it feels cruel. Until you remember she's the only reason you're not already dead in 3 separate scenarios since yesterday morning. So shut up. And fly it again. He flew it again. When the dome finally lowered for the last time, sweat-soaked and trembling, Dax climbed out to find Marlowe already standing beside her own simulator, unclipped, unbothered, watching him with an expression he couldn't quite name. Better, she said. That's it? Better? You wanted a parade? I wanted... He stopped. Started over. I wanted to know if I'm going to die tonight. Something shifted behind her eyes. Not softness, exactly. Something adjacent to it. Something that had clearly been locked away for so long it had forgotten how to fully open, even when it wanted to. Everyone who flies tonight might die tonight, she said quietly. That's not a comfort. It's just the truth. And I've found people fly better when they're not lied to about the math. She studied him another moment. But you flew that stall clean the last 4 times. If you fly it half that clean at 40,000 feet with a live missile behind you, you'll walk away. And you? She didn't answer that one either. She just turned and started walking toward the ready room, and Dax found himself jogging half a step to catch up, because something in him, something new, something that hadn't existed 48 hours ago, didn't want to let her walk away without an answer. Captain, he caught her arm. Barely. Just fingertips against fleece. She stopped, looked down at his hand, then up at his face, and he pulled back instantly, because whatever was behind those gray eyes in that instant was not something he wanted to provoke by accident. Sorry. He exhaled. You keep flying like the mission's the only thing that matters. Like you're not planning on walking away from tonight at all. For a long moment, she said nothing. Get some rest, Lieutenant, she said finally, and there was something almost gentle buried underneath the flatness of it. Something he wouldn't fully understand until much later. You've got 4 hours before we're airborne. Spend them sleeping. Not asking questions I'm not ready to answer. She walked away. He let her go this time. But he didn't sleep. Not really. He lay on a cot in a Spartan Frostgate barracks room, with his eyes open in the dark, replaying the flinch. The half-second stillness of her hand on the table when Kessler said training accident. The way her voice had gone from flat to something almost brittle for exactly as long as it took him to notice, and then flat again, sealed shut like a hatch on a submarine preparing to dive. Something happened to her, he thought. Something with a training accident in it. Something that made her flint at a phrase most people would let pass right through them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that she asked for me by name. 2 floors above him, in a room even more Spartan than his own, Marlowe sat cross-legged on a cot with a laptop open on her knees. The screen's glow, the only light in the room. Her father's dog tags looped once around her wrist. She wasn't supposed to have access to this file. She'd built the access anyway, slowly, over 3 years, favor by favor, the way you build anything that isn't supposed to exist. The screen showed raw signals intelligence, a scrolling column of intercepted radio frequencies logged from the hostile PMC's communications during their approach to the atoll, gathered by an orbital asset over the last 36 hours. Mostly noise, mostly nothing, the kind of low-priority traffic an analyst would glance at and dismiss. Except one frequency kept repeating, a tracking beacon signature, buried in the noise, cycling on a pattern she recognized the way you recognize a voice in a crowded room. Before you've consciously placed whose voice it is, she sat up straight. No, that's not possible. That frequency pattern is classified above your clearance level even now, and it shouldn't exist anywhere outside a single archived flight recorder buried in a vault you had to bribe your way into 3 years ago just to look at it once. She pulled up a second file, older. The metadata timestamp read 9 years back. A flight recorder transcript, heavily redacted, most of the page blacked out in thick official bars except for a single line of raw telemetry data near the bottom. She placed the two screens side by side. The frequency patterns matched. Not similar, not close, identical. Her hands had gone cold. She noticed this distantly, the way you notice weather through a window, because the rest of her had gone somewhere else entirely, back 9 years. Back to a phone call at 19 years old. Back to a folded flag in a sealed casket, and 3 sentences typed on government letterhead that had never once, not for a single day since, added up to the truth. That frequency belonged to my father's squadron. That exact frequency. That exact pattern. Encoded into a private military company's tracking beacon. Tonight, on the other side of the world from where he died. Which means either this is the wildest coincidence in the history of military signals intelligence, or someone recycled a dead program's encryption architecture. Except programs like that don't get recycled by accident. They get recycled by people who already had access. People who knew the codes existed in the first place. People who were there. She closed the laptop, slowly, her breathing carefully even. The way she'd trained her breathing to stay even through every one of the worst moments of the last 9 years. Somebody connected to my father's death is connected to tonight's mission. I don't know who yet, but I'm flying into that airspace in 3 hours anyway. And now I don't know if I'm flying toward a satellite drive, or toward an answer I've been chasing since I was 19 years old. She lay back on the cot, eyes open in the dark, the dog tags still looped around her wrist, and did not sleep either. Frostgate Air Force Base sat at the edge of the world, or close enough to it, that the distinction stopped mattering somewhere around the 3rd consecutive hour of gray Alaskan twilight. Snow fell sideways across the flight line in thin, stinging sheets, and the wind carried a cold that found its way through every seam in a flight suit, no matter how well it was sealed. Dax stood beside his jet in the pre-dawn dark, running his gloved hand along the cold metal skin of the fuselage, feeling the newly bolted radar reflectors under his palm like foreign objects grafted onto something that had once been elegant. Loudest, most aggressive, most brilliantly irritating target in the sky, he thought. Great. Wonderful. Career goals right here. Marlowe emerged from the hangar in her sterile black flight suit, helmet under one arm, moving with the same economical stillness she'd carried into every room since the moment he'd first seen her. She stopped beside her own jet, unmarked, unremarkable, built to disappear into radar clutter the way a shadow disappears into deeper shadow. And, for a moment, just before she climbed the ladder, she looked out at the black water beyond the runway lights, and something crossed her face that Dax had never seen there before. Not fear. Something closer to grief, wearing fear's coat, because it was the only one warm enough for the weather. Captain, he said it quietly, close enough that only she would hear it over the wind. Whatever's out there tonight, whatever you're really flying toward. He hesitated. I've got your back, whatever that's worth. She looked at him for a long moment. It's worth more than you think, Lieutenant, she said, and something in her voice cracked, just slightly, just enough for him to hear it, before she sealed it back shut and climbed the ladder into her cockpit without another word. 6 hours later, in total darkness, 2 unmarked F-22 Raptors screamed 50 feet above the black surface of the North Pacific at 600 miles an hour. Running full emissions control, radios silent, running lights dark, invisible to anything but each other. Dax's breathing echoed inside his oxygen mask, loud and mechanical in his own ears. Off his left wing, a mile back and slightly high, Marlowe's jet was nothing more than a faint thermal smear against the freezing air, visible only through his night vision, gone the instant he blinked. On his tactical display, a data-linked feed from a distant airborne radar plane painted the grim shape of what waited above them. 2 red triangles, the hostile Kestrel pattern interceptors, carved slow, patient circles at 35,000 feet. Predators, waiting. 10 seconds to push point. His heart hammered against his ribs like something trying to break out. 3, 2, 1, push. He slammed the throttle to the stops. The engines howled, full afterburner. 70,000 pounds of thrust threw him back into his seat with bone-deep force as he hauled the stick into a violent 60-degree climb, breaking through the low cloud deck at 10,000 feet. And right there, he flipped the switches. He'd prayed 100 times over the last 6 hours he'd never actually have to use. Radar reflectors active. Radar full power. In a world built entirely on staying invisible, Dax Sawyer had just set off a flare in a dark room and screamed through a megaphone. The alarms hit instantly. Beep, 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 beep. The radar warning receiver's shriek filled his cockpit, high and relentless. The sound of an active lock. And somewhere above him, 2 Kestrel pattern interceptors abandoned their lazy chill patrol and turned, hard, toward the sudden, enormous contact blooming out of the clouds beneath them. Spike. 2 hostiles. High and turning. He barked it into the radio, the drilled protocol taking over where thought had stopped working. Mud 35 closing fast. 2 smaller triangles detached from the hostile icons on his display. Missiles. Burning through the thin upper atmosphere at 4 times the speed of sound. Heading, with mathematical indifference, straight for his face. Defending. He forced the word out through gritted teeth, chest compressing under the climb, and counted 1, 2, 3, letting the missiles build their kinematic energy exactly the way Marlowe had drilled into him, exactly the way the math demanded. Then he hit the jettison. The external tanks and radar reflectors tore free from his wings and tumbled away into the dark, and freed of their drag and their treacherous reflectivity, the Raptor became a ghost again in an instant. But the missiles already had his trajectory. He rolled inverted, hauled the stick into his lap. The G-meter spiked past 9, his vision graying at the edges as the blood fled his brain, his suit clenching around his legs like a fist, trying to keep him conscious through sheer mechanical will. He dove for the black water, streaming chaff and flares in a continuous, blinding trail, and behind him, through the canopy, 2 brilliant white lines of missile exhaust arsed down through the darkness, chasing heat and metal that were no longer where the missiles expected them to be. Boom, boom. Twin fireballs bloomed above him, painting the cloud deck orange for half a second before the dark swallowed the light whole. He leveled out at 500 feet, breathing like a man who'd just run a marathon, hands trembling so badly he could barely hold the stick steady. Alive, I'm alive. I pulled them down. I did the thing. His radio crackled. Ordnance away. Marlowe's voice. Cold, calm, rasping through the static. Target confirmed. Package away. On the digital map, a soundless white flash bloomed over the atoll the satellite drive, and everything around it vaporized in a single, precise strike, gone before the sound of it would ever reach anyone who mattered. She did it. She actually. But Dax's relief lasted exactly as long as it took him to glance back at his display. One of the Kestrel interceptors wasn't turning back toward its patrol route. It was banking hard, north, toward the atoll, toward Marlowe. No, 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 no. Because when Marlowe had opened her weapons bay to drop the strike package, her stealth profile had cracked open for the smallest fraction of a second long enough, apparently, for one very good, very aggressive enemy pilot to catch the blip and refuse to let it go. Charon, you've got a leaker. His voice cracked as he shouted it, banking hard to bring his own jet back around. Flankers turning north, closing on your position fast. Copy. Her voice infuriatingly steady, energy states low. Can't outrun him, bled too much speed on the drop. She's a sitting duck. She just saved every man and woman this country's put in that satellite's blind spot. And now she's a sitting duck because of half a second of open bay doors. Something in Dax's chest went very still and very clear, in the way that fear sometimes clarifies instead of clouding. She chose me because I'm loud. Because I'm bait. Because I'm exactly stupid and aggressive enough to make myself the biggest, dumbest target in the sky. Fine. Let's be that. Hold your heading, he snapped into the radio, already slamming the throttle forward, dragging the nose of his jet around toward the enemy's flight path. I'm coming. Negative, Havoc. For the first time since he'd met her, real urgency cracked through the flatness of her voice. You do not have the fuel state for a second engagement. Didn't ask permission. He gritted it out through the G-forces crushing his chest. Brake right when I tell you, not before. Below him, the Kestrel interceptor dove hard on Marlowe's thermal signature, its nose tracking down toward the faint, low-energy ghost of her jet against the freezing ice below. And Dax understood, with sudden and total clarity, that he was not going to reach her in time by flying straight at her. Unless I do the thing. The thing she drilled into me 11 times in a dome that felt like it was trying to break my spine. The thing that shouldn't work, that defies every rule of energy management a pilot's ever been taught. Because sometimes the rules are exactly what gets you killed. He killed his throttle, threw the stick hard, into the stall. The Raptor shuddered, screamed in protest, flipped nose over tail exactly the way it had 11 times in the simulator, and for one long, terrifying, weightless second, Dax hung suspended in the black Alaskan sky, with his stomach somewhere up near his throat and absolutely no forward momentum at all, directly in the path of a Kestrel interceptor closing at 400 knots. The enemy pilot, target suddenly and impossibly stationary in his windscreen, had no time to react. Dax's nose dropped. The interceptor's exhaust filled his HUD, massive and unmissable, and the infrared tone screamed its perfect lock directly into his ears. Fox 2. The missile leapt free, covered the distance in less than a heartbeat, buried itself deep in the Kestrel's engine housing. The night sky detonated. The interceptor came apart in a blinding orange bloom, scattering burning debris across the black water below, and the shockwave rocked Dax's jet hard enough to rattle his teeth even a half-mile out. Silence after. The kind of silence that rings. "Splash 1, he said, and his voice shook so badly he barely recognized it as his own. For 3 full seconds, the radio gave him nothing back. Did I lose the link? Did I lose her? Did I do all of that and stood kill havoc? Her voice finally, quiet, rough at the edges in a way it hadn't been before. Second bandit's turning tail. Airspace is clear. Something in Dax's chest that had been clenched tight since the moment he'd killed his throttle. Finally, slowly let go. The flight back to Frostgate passed in near total silence. Fuel gauges creeping toward empty, the black ocean sliding beneath them in the dark, like something patient and ancient that had simply decided, tonight, not to claim them. They touched down on a snow-dusted runway, with less than 5 minutes of usable fuel remaining in either tank. Inside the guarded hangar, engines shutting down, the silence that followed the howling turbines felt heavy enough to lean against. Dax sat in his cockpit for a long moment before climbing down, staring at dark instrument panels, because some part of him needed those extra 60 seconds to remember how to be a person who wasn't currently strapped into a fighter jet fighting for his life. I took a life tonight. Not a simulated kill count, not a number on a scoreboard. A real one. And somehow that doesn't feel like the part of tonight that's going to keep me awake. He climbed down on unsteady legs to find Marlowe already on the ground, handing her helmet to a silent crew chief, her face pale under the hangar's harsh lights, her hands not quite steady either. She looked, for the first time since he'd met her, less like a legend and more like a person. "The first one's always the hardest," she said quietly, before he could speak. "Doesn't get easier. You just get better at putting it somewhere you don't have to look at it every day. You knew he'd break off and dive on your signature." Dax's voice came out rougher than he intended. "You used yourself as bait to draw him in low. You would have let him get you." She didn't answer right away. "A mission's a series of calculated risks, Lieutenant. The objective was the drive. The objective was achieved." Her eyes drifted, briefly, toward the open hangar doors and the black, starless sky beyond them. "If my jet had gone into the ice tonight to make sure that drive burned, that would have been an acceptable variable." "I don't accept it," Dax said, and the words came out with a heat that surprised even him. "I don't care what column it goes in on somebody's spreadsheet. That's not acceptable to me." Something shifted behind her eyes. Something that had been locked down for longer than he could guess, cracking open just slightly, just for a second, before the discipline of 9 years snapped it shut again. "Get some rest," she said. "We're not done tonight." "What do you mean, not done?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into a secure case a technician had just wheeled out from beneath her jet, the recovered drive, or a copy of it, salvaged in the last seconds before the strike, small and unassuming and worth, apparently, more than either of their lives combined. "There's a partial data fragment," she said quietly. "Recovered before the strike went in. Corrupted. Most of it's garbage." Her jaw tightened. "But there's a piece that isn't." She led him into a small secure room off the main hangar, where a technician had already begun running the fragment through decryption software on an air-gapped terminal. Lines of corrupted data scrolled past, mostly noise, mostly static, the digital wreckage of a hard drive that had spent 48 hours in freezing salt water before anyone got near it. Then, buried in the noise, a single decrypted audio segment flagged green. The technician looked up. "Ma'am, you'll want to hear this." He played it. The audio was garbled, half-static, degraded almost past recognition, but not quite. A voice, distorted and distant, speaking in the clipped, formal cadence of an official order given 9 years ago, and somehow impossibly preserved in the digital wreckage of a satellite that had spent 6 months watching this exact stretch of frozen ocean. "Spectre is compromised. Authorization confirmed. Disavow." The room went very still. Marlowe did not move, did not breathe. For a long moment, the color draining slowly from her face in a way that had nothing to do with cold or altitude or exhaustion. Spectre, her father's call sign. Disavow. The word that had haunted every sleepless night for 9 years, printed nowhere in any official document. Spoken only in a whisper by a source she'd bribed and begged and threatened her way toward over 3 long years of quiet, patient digging. And here it was, preserved by accident, in the wreckage of a satellite, watching an ocean 12,000 miles from where it happened, because someone 9 years ago used the same encrypted channel to order her father's death that a private military company was still using tonight. It's real. It happened. He didn't die in an accident. Someone ordered it. Someone gave the authorization. Someone said the word disavow into a radio, and 3 days later they handed me a folded flag and told me my father made a mistake that killed him. Her hands had gone white-knuckled against the edge of the terminal desk. Dax, standing behind her, said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have been an intrusion into something too large and too old for words to touch yet. "Ma'am." The technician's voice was careful. "There's a voice print match function on this system. If you want to run it against known personnel, run it," Marlowe said. Her voice had gone somewhere flat and distant that Dax hadn't heard from her before, not even in the sim dome, not even at 40,000 feet, with a missile climbing toward her jet. The technician typed. The system churned, comparing the degraded audio fragment against a database of voice prints on file, a long, agonizing 30 seconds during which nobody in the room breathed. A result populated on the screen. Match probability, 91.4% subject Kessler, Nathaniel R. Clearance. Program director current assignment. The silence that followed had weight, had gravity, pressed down on the small room like the deep ocean pressure that had crushed the satellite's outer casing on its way to the seafloor. Marlowe stared at the screen without blinking, without speaking, for what felt to Dax like a very long time. "Ma'am," the technician said quietly, uncertainly. "Should I flag this for—" "No." Her voice cut through the room like a blade. "You didn't see this. This terminal's contents are mine, effective immediately, under my clearance." The technician's hands went very still on the keyboard. "Yes, ma'am." Dax stepped closer, keeping his voice low, the way you keep your voice low around something that might shatter if handled too roughly. "Marlowe." He used her first name for the first time, and neither of them acknowledged it, because there wasn't room in the moment for anything except what was on that screen. "Kessler's the director of this program. The man who briefed us 6 hours ago. The man who's currently running the mission you just risked your life for." "I know." Her voice had gone very quiet, very controlled, the controlled quiet of someone standing at the very edge of something and refusing, through sheer will alone, to let herself fall over it yet. "He's the one who ordered your father's death." "I know." Softer this time, almost a whisper. "So what happens now?" She turned to face him, and in the harsh fluorescent light of that small, secure room, 12,000 miles from the ice where her father had died, and 9 years too late to save him, Marlowe Ashworth's gray eyes had gone hard and cold and utterly, terrifyingly clear. "Now," she said, "I find out how far this goes, and then I make him answer for it." Outside the hangar, the Alaskan dawn had begun to break over the runway, a thin, gray light that did nothing to warm the air and everything to illuminate, in stark and unforgiving detail, exactly how far Marlowe Ashworth still had to fall before this was finally fully over. She didn't sleep that morning either. She sat alone in her Spartan quarters with her father's dog tags in one hand and a single sheet of paper in the other, a printed transcript of 91.4%, a number that had just rewritten 9 years of grief into something with a name and a face and an office 3 time zones away. "I know who you are now," she thought, and the thought arrived with a stillness that frightened her more than any missile lock ever had. "I know your name. I know your voice. I know you sat across a table from me yesterday and called Dax the bait with a smile on your face. The same smile you probably wore the day you disavowed my father like he was a line item in a budget report. You don't know that I know. Not yet. And that's the only advantage I have left." She closed her hand around the tags until the metal edges bit into her palm, and outside her window, the pale Alaskan sun finally cleared the horizon, throwing long, cold shadows across the snow, the same shadows, she thought distantly, that had probably fallen across a different stretch of frozen ground 9 years ago, on a day nobody had ever told her the full truth about. Soon she promised the dawn, the same promise she'd made in the dark 2 nights before, except now it had teeth. "Soon, Nathaniel. Soon you're going to learn exactly what it costs to disavow the wrong pilot's daughter." The flight back from Frostgate took 9 hours, 3 refueling stops, and not one single conversation that mattered. Which was fine, because some things don't get said at altitude. Some things wait for solid ground. Marlowe stared out the small, oval window of the transport aircraft, at clouds sliding past like something indifferent to everything happening beneath them, and she held her father's dog tags in her closed fist the entire way home, the metal warm now from her own skin instead of cold from 9 years of sitting untouched in a box. 91.4%, she thought. That's not a maybe. That's not a coincidence. That's a man's voice, on a recording, ordering the death of the best pilot I ever knew, my father. And that man briefed me 6 hours before I nearly died retrieving the exact drive that proves it. He sat across the table. He smiled. He called Dax the bait like it was nothing. Because to him it is nothing. It's always been nothing. That's what 9 years of getting away with it does to a man. It makes murder into paperwork. Beside her, Dax slept fitfully, his head against the vibrating fuselage, and even in sleep his brow stayed furrowed, like some part of him kept replaying the stall maneuver, kept replaying the fireball, kept replaying the 3 seconds of silence before her voice finally came back over the radio. She didn't wake him. She let him sleep, because whatever came next, he was going to need it. Blackridge greeted them with the same low, bruised Virginia sky it always wore. But Marlowe noticed, the moment the wheels touched down, that something in the air felt different now, sharper, like the whole base had become a minefield she hadn't finished mapping yet, and every hangar, every office, every familiar face might be standing on ground that would blow the moment she stepped wrong. She went straight to Colonel Shaw's office. Didn't knock. Didn't wait to be announced. Shaw looked up from his desk, took one look at her face, and closed the door himself before she'd even finished crossing the threshold. Marlowe. Just her name. No rank. He hadn't called her that since she was 19 years old and sitting across from him in a different office in a different uniform. Learning for the first time that her father wasn't coming home. What happened? She set the transcript down on his desk without a word. He read it twice. And Marlowe watched something in the old colonel's face crack open that she had never once seen crack in 9 years of knowing him, not at her father's memorial, not at any of the quiet, off-the-record conversations they'd had since, not even the night she'd first told him she didn't believe the official story, and he hadn't argued with her. 91%, he said quietly. Point 4. That's not a maybe. No, Marlowe said. It's not. Shaw sat back slowly, the chair creaking under him, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Just stared at the printed page like it might rearrange itself into something less true if he looked hard enough. I need you to tell me something, Marlowe said, and I need the truth, because I have spent 9 years being lied to by people I trusted, and I don't have room left inside me for one more version of events that isn't real. Ask. Did you know? The question hung there. Sharp. Simple. The only question that mattered. No. Shaw's voice didn't waver. I suspected. I never had proof. I fought for an investigation the year after your father died, and I got shut down so fast and so completely that I understood, without anyone spelling it out for me, that fighting harder would only get me removed from any position where I could still watch over you. His jaw tightened. So I stayed quiet. I kept my rank. I kept my access. And I made sure that whatever happened to your father, it never happened to you. That's the only thing I could give you for 9 years, Marlowe. A watchful eye and a closed mouth. I know it wasn't enough. He's telling the truth, she thought, and something in her chest, something that had been braced for another betrayal, another layer of the lie loosened, just slightly, just enough to breathe around, which means I have exactly one ally in this building who isn't compromised, and I'm about to ask him to help me bring down a man who controls half the classified budget in this program. I need help, she said. Not permission. Help. Shaw studied her for a long moment. What do you need? Access. Records from 9 years ago. Personnel rosters, deployment schedules. Anything that puts Kessler in a position to authorize a disavowal order on a program he wasn't officially running yet. She leaned forward. He's a program director now. 9 years ago he wasn't. Which means either he had authority he shouldn't have had, or someone above him gave the order and he just delivered it. You think there's someone above him? I don't know yet. Her voice had gone hard, precise. The voice she used at 40,000 feet with a missile climbing toward her jet. But I intend to find out. Quietly. Before he finds out, I know. Shaw was already reaching for a secure phone on his desk. Give me 48 hours, he said. I still have friends who owe me favors older than you are. Dax found her 3 hours later in the small, windowless office space attached to the SIF, surrounded by files that had no business existing outside a vault. Her eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion and reading, a legal pad beside her covered in handwriting that had grown smaller and more cramped as the pages accumulated. You should sleep, he said. You should mind your own business. You made it my business. He pulled a chair over, sat down across from her without being invited, which she noted, despite herself, was becoming something of a habit. You put my name on a plan that almost got me killed by an aircraft I'll never officially admit existed. I think that buys me the right to ask if you're okay. She didn't answer right away. Her eyes stayed on the file in front of her, a personnel roster from 9 years ago. Half the names redacted, the other half meaning nothing to her yet. I'm not okay, she said finally. I haven't been okay in 9 years. I've just gotten very good at flying like I am. Something in Dax's chest tightened at that, because it was the most honest thing she'd said to him since the moment they'd met. And honesty, from Marlowe Ashworth, apparently cost more than most people's entire vocabulary. Tell me what I can do, he said. Not what you think I should be doing, what you actually need. She looked up at him then, gray eyes searching his face for a long moment, like she was recalibrating something, some private internal instrument that measured whether a person was worth trusting with the truth. I need someone who doesn't have 9 years of grief clouding his judgment, she said slowly. Someone who can look at these files with fresh eyes and catch what I keep missing, because I already know what I'm hoping to find. And hope is a terrible editor. Then hand them over. She did. They worked through the night. Files, rosters, deployment logs, budget authorizations buried in appendices. Nobody was ever supposed to read closely. Around 2 in the morning, Dax pushed a document across the table, tapping one line with his finger. This. His voice had an edge of discovery in it, quiet but sharp. Budget authorization 9 years ago, signed off by a deputy director position that got dissolved the following year. Guess who filled it before it dissolved? Marlowe leaned in. Read the name, Kessler. Not program director yet. Not the smiling man in the gray suit who'd sat across from her 2 days ago calling Dax the bait. 9 years ago, he'd been a deputy, smaller title, smaller office, but apparently already holding the kind of authority that let a signature on a budget line quietly reroute classified funds into a program nobody outside a handful of people had clearance to name. He had access, she said softly. 9 years ago, before anyone thought to watch him. What was the program? Marlowe flipped to the next redacted page, and her stomach dropped. Stealth radar signature calibration data. Export classification, restricted. Destination, unlisted. He wasn't just covering something up, she said. And her voice had gone very quiet, very still, the way it went right before a lock tone screamed in her headset. He was selling something. Radar cross-section data. Signature calibration files. The exact kind of information that would let a hostile power start building countermeasures against stealth aircraft. And your father found out. My father flew signals intelligence on classified test ranges. The pieces were falling into place now, fast, faster than she could fully process them, each one landing like a physical blow. If anyone was positioned to notice anomalies in how test data was being routed, it would have been him. So he found something, Dax said slowly, reported it, and instead of an investigation, he got disavowed. Marlowe's hands had curled into fists on the table, because an investigation would have exposed Kessler. And Kessler had enough authority, even then, to make sure it never happened. He didn't order my father shot down because of some tactical necessity. Her voice cracked, just slightly, just once, before she forced it back level. He ordered it because my father was going to expose him. The room fell silent, the weight of it pressing down like the copper-shielded walls themselves had grown heavier. Marlowe, Dax said her name carefully, the way you'd approach something wounded and unpredictable. This isn't a 9-year-old cold case anymore. This is a man who's still active, still in power, still running the exact program you're currently assigned to. He leaned forward. If he finds out what we know, he won't. You don't know that. I know that if he suspected we knew, we'd already be dead. Her eyes met his, hard and clear. Which means, right now, tonight, we still have the only advantage that matters. He thinks I'm still grieving quietly. He thinks the transfer, the mission, all of it, was just business. He has no idea what that satellite drive actually gave us. Except, a cold voice whispered somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice she'd learned, over 9 years, never to ignore. Except you don't actually know that for certain. Except men like Kessler don't survive 9 years at the top of a classified program by being careless. Except he might already know more than you think. She pushed the thought down. Not gone. Just filed, the way she filed everything that threatened to slow her down at exactly the wrong moment. Get some rest, she told Dax. Tomorrow we take this to Shaw, carefully, and then we decide how to bring him down without burying ourselves in the process. Dax didn't move. Marlowe. What? For what it's worth. His voice had gone quieter than she'd ever heard it, stripped of every trace of the swagger that had walked into that briefing room 3 days ago, like he owned the sky. I'm glad you picked me, even if it was because I'm predictable and loud, and exactly the kind of idiot who makes good bait. Something almost like a smile ghosted across her mouth. Almost. Don't get used to the compliment, she said. I still haven't decided if it was a compliment. But when she said it, there was warmth in it, real warmth. The first she'd let herself feel fully in longer than she wanted to admit. 2 floors above the SIF, in an office with a view of the Blackridge flight line and a desk clear enough to suggest a man who trusted very little to paper, Director Nathaniel Kessler sat alone with a secure phone pressed to his ear, his voice pitched low, his expression, in the dim light of his single desk lamp, entirely different from the warm, practiced smile he wore in briefing rooms. She pulled archived personnel files. The voice on the other end said, 9-year-old rosters. Budget authorizations. Someone flagged the access request this morning. Kessler's jaw tightened. Whose clearance? Ashworth's. And a Lieutenant Sawyer's, attached under her authority. Silence stretched on the line, long enough that the man on the other end finally spoke again, uncertain. "Sir?" "She's smarter than her father," Kessler said quietly, and there was no warmth in his voice, now at all, none of the boardroom charm, nothing but something cold and calculating, and entirely without conscience. Julian took 3 years to start asking the right questions. She's done it in 9 days. Because she's had 9 years to prepare for exactly this moment, he thought. And the realization arrived without panic, only the flat, practical recalibration of a man accustomed to solving inconvenient problems. Because I disavowed her father and thought that was the end of it. Because I never once considered that grief, given enough time and enough motive, becomes something far more dangerous than love ever was. Options, he said aloud. We could initiate a security review, restrict her clearance pending investigation. Slow her down. No, Kessler cut him off. A security review generates paperwork. Paperwork generates witnesses. I want this handled the way the first one was handled. His voice went flatter still, colder, the voice of a man reciting logistics instead of a death sentence, though it was, in every way that mattered, exactly that. Clean, deniable, and final. Sir, this isn't a foreign operative. She's one of our own. She was one of our own 9 years ago too, Lieutenant. Kessler's voice carried the particular patience of a man who had done this before and found the doing of it, over time, easier rather than harder. That distinction didn't save her father. It won't save her. He gave the order. Set up a training exercise. High risk, live fire over restricted airspace, the kind of mission that generates its own convenient tragedy if something goes wrong. Falsify the authorization chain so it traces back to a program that officially doesn't exist. Run by a director who officially never gave the order. Assign Ashworth and Sawyer as the lead element, and make sure that whatever happened out there would be no flight recorder left intact enough to argue otherwise. He hung up the phone and sat for a long moment in the dim glow of his desk lamp, looking out at the dark Virginia sky beyond his window, feeling, if he felt anything at all, only the mild, practical regret of a man closing out an old account that had, against considerable odds, refused to stay closed. 9 years, he thought. I gave her 9 years she wasn't supposed to have. That's more mercy than her father got. The next morning arrived under a sky the color of old bruises, and Marlowe woke to find a mission tasking order already sitting in her secure inbox, stamped with an authorization chain that looked, on its surface, entirely routine. High-altitude interception drill, restricted airspace over the coastal test range, live ordnance, controlled parameters. Lead element, Ashworth. Wingman Sawyer. Something about it snagged wrong in her chest before her conscious mind had even finished reading it. Too soon, she thought. We just got back from Broken Mirror 40 hours ago. Neither of us has had a full maintenance cycle on our jets. And this authorization, she scrolled down, checked the signature chain, filed under Program 7. Program 7 doesn't exist. I've never heard of Program 7 in 3 years of digging through this base's classified architecture, which means somebody built it specifically for this tasking order, which means somebody wanted a mission that traces back to nowhere. Her hands had gone cold, the same cold they'd gone the night the voice print match populated on that terminal screen in Frostgate. He knows. He knows I pulled the files. He knows what I found. And this isn't a training drill. This is a training accident, the same kind that killed my father. Wearing a different date and 2 different names. She was already moving, already pulling on her jacket, already halfway to the door before the thought had finished forming, because 9 years of grief had taught her exactly one thing above all others. When the ground starts feeling wrong beneath your feet, you don't wait around to confirm it. You move. She found Dax in the mess hall, halfway through a cup of coffee he wouldn't finish, and the look on her face must have said everything before she opened her mouth, because he was on his feet before she'd crossed half the room. What? We've been tasked. She kept her voice low, controlled. The way she'd learned to keep her voice controlled through 9 years of carrying things too heavy to say out loud. High-risk exercise, restricted airspace, filed under a program designation that doesn't exist anywhere in this base's records. When? 6 hours. Marlowe, Dax's coffee, sat forgotten, going cold on the table. I think this is the same thing that happened to my father. Her voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just once. Before she forced it back level with an act of will, Dax could almost physically see her performing. Except this time I know his name, and I am not going to fly into a restricted training range and let him erase me the same way he erased my father, without a single soul on this base ever knowing what actually happened. Dax's jaw set, hard, so we don't fly it. If we refuse the tasking, he knows we're onto him for certain. Right now there's still a small chance he's guessing. She was already thinking 3 moves ahead, the way she always thought, the way that had kept her alive through 9 years of missions this base would never officially admit happened. But if we fly it exactly as ordered, we walk straight into whatever he's built to kill us. So what's the third option? Marlowe looked at him for a long moment, and something in her expression, steel and grief, and a resolve that had been 9 years in the making, settled into place like a bolt sliding home. We fly it, she said, but not the way he expects. She found Colonel Shaw in his office 20 minutes later, laid out the tasking order and the non-existent program designation and her theory of what it meant, and watched the old colonel's face go through disbelief, and then fury, and then something harder and more resolved than either. I can't stop the tasking without exposing that we're onto him, Shaw said, reading the order twice, 3 times, his weathered hands tightening on the paper. Not without giving him time to bury it deeper, or worse, accelerate the timeline before we're ready. I know. So what do you need from me? Eyes. Marlowe leaned forward, her voice dropping into the flat, precise register she used at altitude with a missile climbing toward her jet. I need every asset you can quietly put in the air or on the ground without it tracing back to this conversation. Recording equipment. A second flight recorder, backed up off the primary aircraft system, that Kessler's people won't know to sabotage. And I need you, personally, listening on a channel he doesn't know exists. Shaw studied her for a long moment. You're planning to bait him. I'm planning to survive whatever he's built, Marlowe said, and come back with proof that finally makes 9 years of lying impossible to sustain. The restricted airspace over the coastal test range stretched empty and gray, beneath a sky heavy with the promise of a storm, still building somewhere out over open water. Marlowe's Raptor cut through the thin morning haze at 30,000 feet. Dax off her wing, both of them running a secondary backup flight recorder Shaw had quietly installed the night before, small, hidden, wired independently of the primary avionics system, the kind of insurance policy you build when you no longer trust the people who are supposed to be protecting you. Talk to me, Marlowe said into the radio. What's on your scope? Nothing yet. Dax's voice, tight with the same coiled tension she could feel in her own chest. Empty range. Just us and a whole lot of gray. Too quiet, she thought. Except quiet isn't safety. Quiet is just the part of the trap where the jaws haven't closed yet. Which means whatever's coming, it's not going to come from the range itself. Her radar picked it up first. A flight of aircraft, 4 strong, climbing out of a base she didn't recognize on her display. Transponders squawking friendly IFF codes, the kind of codes that told every automated system on her jet, "These are ours, hold your fire, these are on our side." 4 inbound, she said, watching the icons resolve on her screen. Friendly IFF. That's not on the tasking order, Dax said slowly. Nobody said anything about a supporting flight. Because there wasn't supposed to be one, Marlowe thought, and something cold slid down her spine as the 4 aircraft began to spread into a formation that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with intercept geometry. Which means Kessler didn't send a training accident. He sent an execution squad, wearing friendly transponders, so that whatever happens next, it looks like exactly the kind of tragic, deniable accident that killed my father 9 years ago. Marlowe. Dax's voice had gone sharp. They're not maintaining separation. They're converging. On us. He weaponized our own side against us. Except that's not entirely true either. Because these pilots don't know what they're flying into. They think this is a legitimate tasking. They think we're the threat. Kessler didn't need to recruit traitors. He just needed to lie to loyal people convincingly enough. The realization landed like a physical blow, worse in some ways than any missile lock, because it meant the men closing on her position weren't villains. They were pawns. Pilots who trusted their orders the way she once had, before 9 years of grief, had taught her exactly how far that trust could be weaponized against you. "Do not engage," she said, her voice suddenly, urgently clear. "Dax, whatever happens, do not fire on those aircraft. They don't know. Marlowe, they're closing." I said, "Do not engage." Her hands moved across her controls with the same economical precision that had dismantled him in a simulator dome 3 days ago. We evade. We survive. We do not create 4 more grieving families to cover up the first one. The lead friendly-coated aircraft banked hard, locking onto her position, and her radar warning receiver began its familiar, dreaded shriek. Beep, beep, beep. They're locking us up. Real weapons. Real missiles. And every single one of them thinks they're doing their job. "Brake right," she snapped, already hauling her own jet into the maneuver, and beside her, a half-second behind, Dax's jet peeled off in the opposite direction, the two of them splitting the formation's attention, buying seconds, only seconds, in a fight where seconds were the only currency that mattered. "Charon, this is Colonel Shaw." A new voice cut through the chaos of the radio, calm, commanding, carrying decades of authority behind every syllable. "I have eyes on this engagement from an independent asset. I am declaring this tasking compromised. All aircraft stand down. I say again, all aircraft stand down." For a moment, nothing changed. The 4 intercepting jets held their locks, their pilots caught between conflicting orders, the tasking that had sent them here, and a colonel's voice cutting across their frequency with an authority that felt, to trained ears, unmistakably real. "This is Blackridge, lead," one of the pilots finally responded, uncertainty threading through his voice for the first time. "Confirm who's declaring stand down." "This is a live tasking, sir." "This tasking was falsified," Shaw's voice thundered back, "under a program designation that does not exist in any authorized Air Force record. You have been ordered to fire on 2 of your own pilots under a lie. I am ordering you to break contact immediately, on my authority as base commander." Silence stretched, long enough that Marlowe's heart hammered against her ribs with a violence that had nothing to do with the G-forces of her evasive turn. "Come on. Come on. Believe him. Please believe him." One by one, the 4 intercepting aircraft broke their locks, peeled off, formed up into a loose formation and began climbing away. Their pilots, Marlowe understood distantly, about to land into a debrief none of them could have possibly seen coming. "Charon." Shaw's voice again, quieter now, weighted with something that sounded almost like relief. "You're clear. Return to base. We have a great deal to discuss." Marlowe exhaled, long and shaking, her hands trembling against the controls for the first time since this entire nightmare had begun. "We survived it, except surviving isn't the same as winning, because he's going to know, the second those 4 pilots land and start asking questions, that his plan failed, and a man like Kessler doesn't sit quietly and wait to be caught. Dax." Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "This isn't over. If anything, it's about to move faster than either of us is ready for." "Then let's be ready," Dax said, and there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there 3 days ago in a briefing room, something forged in fire and cold ocean water, and a simulator dome that had broken him down to nothing before building him back into someone worth trusting. "Whatever's next. I'm not going anywhere." They landed at Blackridge to find Colonel Shaw waiting on the tarmac himself, flanked by 2 security officers whose presence told Marlowe, before a single word was spoken, that the ground beneath everyone's feet had just shifted permanently. "He knows we're onto him," Marlowe said, pulling off her helmet before she'd even finished walking clear of her jet. which means he's not going to wait around for due process. I've already restricted his access to base security systems, Shaw said grimly, on the authority of the falsified tasking order alone. That buys us hours, not days. Where is he? Still in his office, as far as we know. Marlowe's jaw tightened, 9 years of grief and 3 days of fury crystallizing into something hard and absolutely certain. Then I'm going to go finish this, she said, face to face. Marlowe Shaw started. I have spent 9 years being lied to by paperwork, she said, and her voice carried a weight that stopped even the old colonel mid-sentence. I am not going to let this end with more paperwork. I want him to look at me when it finally comes apart. I want him to know exactly whose daughter is standing in front of him. Dax fell into step beside her without being asked. You're not doing this alone, he said. I didn't ask you to come. You didn't have to. She didn't argue further. There wasn't time, and some part of her, some part that had spent 9 years learning to trust almost no one had already decided. Somewhere over the black water off Alaska, that Dax Sawyer had earned the right to stand beside her for whatever came next. The walk to Kessler's office felt longer than it should have, the corridors of the administrative building strangely quiet, strangely empty, as though the base itself had sensed something coming and cleared out of its path. Marlowe didn't knock. She opened the door and stepped inside to find Nathaniel Kessler standing at his window, a secure phone in one hand, his composed, practiced face rearranging itself. In the half-second before he registered who had entered, into something colder and far more honest. Captain Ashworth. He set the phone down slowly, his voice recovering its warmth almost instantly, the mask sliding back into place with the ease of long practice. I understand there was some confusion out on the range this morning. I'll be looking into it personally. Don't, Marlowe said quietly. Don't do that. Don't stand there and perform for me. Not after everything I know. Something flickered behind Kessler's eyes. A brief, cold calculation. I don't know what you think you know, Captain, but I'd strongly advise Spectre is compromised. Marlowe's voice came out flat, precise, each word landing like a dropped stone in still water. Authorization confirmed. Disavow. She watched his face as she said it, watched for the tell, and found it a small, involuntary stillness around his eyes, there and gone in an instant. But she had spent 3 days learning exactly how to read the smallest tells on the smallest muscles of a man's face. And she caught it. 9 years old. Recovered off a satellite drive you sent me to retrieve. Voice print match, 91.4%. Your voice, Director. Ordering my father's death. The silence that followed had teeth. That's an extraordinary claim, Kessler said finally, his voice carefully, deliberately even. Degraded audio. Statistical matches. None of that would survive scrutiny in any legitimate review. I'm not planning to submit it for a legitimate review, Marlowe said. I'm planning to walk it directly to people whose scrutiny you can't quietly redirect. People above your authorization chain. People who are going to want to know why a deputy director 9 years ago was routing classified stealth signature data to an unlisted destination, and why the one signals officer who noticed ended up dead in a training accident 3 weeks later. Kessler's composure cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, and, for the first time since she'd met him, Marlowe saw the man underneath, the practiced warmth cold, calculating, and beneath all of it, afraid. You have no idea what you're playing with, he said, and his voice had dropped its warmth entirely now, gone flat and hard. That program funded capabilities this country needed. Your father was going to expose an operation that was going to expose you, Marlowe cut in. Say it, just once. Say the true version out loud. Kessler's jaw tightened. For a long moment he said nothing. Then his hand moved, fast, toward a drawer in his desk, and Dax was moving before Marlowe's mind had even finished registering the threat, closing the distance in 2 long strides and slamming the drawer shut with the flat of his hand a half-second before Kessler's fingers reached it. Don't, Dax said, low and cold. All the swagger of 3 days ago burned away into something harder and far more dangerous. Don't make this worse than it already is. Kessler froze, his hand still hovering over the desk, and in his eyes, for just a moment, Marlowe saw the exact calculation of a cornered animal, weighing its remaining options and finding all of them bad. The office door burst open behind them. Colonel Shaw stepped through, flanked by 2 security officers, and, behind them, a man in a plain dark suit Marlowe didn't recognize, carrying a leather folder embossed with a seal she'd never had clearance to see before this exact moment. Nathaniel Kessler. The man in the suit spoke with quiet, absolute authority. "I'm with the Inspector General's office. We've been building a parallel investigation into Program 7's funding irregularities for the past 6 months. Captain Ashworth's evidence, combined with what we already have, is more than sufficient to authorize your immediate detention pending formal charges." Kessler's face went the color of old ash. 6 months, he said, almost to himself, the words coming out hollow. "You've been watching 6 months, and you let a mission proceed this morning that could have—" "We let it proceed," the man said evenly, "because we needed to see exactly how far you'd go to protect yourself once you believed you were cornered." "You gave us that this morning, Director. In writing, in a falsified authorization chain that traces directly back to your personal access credentials." Marlowe felt something enormous move loose inside her chest. 9 years of grief, of unanswered questions, of a folded flag that had never once made sense. All of it shifting, finally, towards something that felt almost like solid ground. Kessler didn't resist as the security officers stepped forward. He simply stood, his shoulders sagging under the sudden, total collapse of 9 years of careful deniability. And for a moment just before they led him out, his eyes found Marlowe's across the room. "Your father," he said quietly, "was a good pilot. I want you to know that wasn't personal." "It was the only thing that was ever personal," Marlowe said, and her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, didn't shake at all. "You just never had the courage to admit it." They led him out. The office fell silent behind him, and Marlowe stood very still in the middle of it, feeling the weight of 9 years finally, slowly, beginning to lift. Not gone, never entirely gone, but no longer sitting alone on her shoulders in the dark. Shaw crossed the room and put a hand on her shoulder, the closest thing to an embrace the old colonel had ever offered her. It's done," he said quietly. "Your father's record will be corrected. Formally, publicly, as much as classification allows. He'll get the honors he was owed 9 years ago." Marlowe closed her eyes, just for a moment, and felt something inside her that had been clenched tight since she was 19 years old. Finally, carefully, begin to release. "Thank you," she said, "for 9 years of watching, even when you couldn't do anything else." "It was the least I owed him," Shaw said, "and the least I owed you." Dax stood a few feet away, quiet, watching, giving her the space this moment deserved, without ever quite stepping far enough away to leave her alone in it. She found his eyes across the room, and something passed between them that neither of them tried to put into words, yet not gratitude exactly, and not quite anything else with a simple name either. Something that had been built, piece by piece, across a briefing room and a simulator dome and a black stretch of freezing ocean, and had somehow survived all of it intact. The formal investigation took 3 weeks. Marlowe testified twice, each time in rooms even more secure than the skiff at Blackridge, laying out 9 years of evidence with the same flat, precise clarity she used on a tactical display at 40,000 feet. Kessler's network unraveled slowly, and then all at once, the way these things tend to, a deputy here, a contractor there, an entire quiet architecture of stolen classified data and buried investigations finally exposed to daylight. After 9 years hidden beneath careful paperwork and a warm, practiced smile, Julian Ashworth's service record was formally corrected on a gray Tuesday morning in late autumn, in a small ceremony at Blackridge, attended by exactly the people who had earned the right to be there: Colonel Shaw, a handful of pilots who had served alongside him, and Marlowe, standing at attention in her dress uniform. For the first time, in longer than she could remember, her father's dog tags looped once around her wrist, beneath her sleeve, where only she would ever know they were there. They read his citation aloud, spoke of valor, spoke of a program that would remain classified even now, even after everything, but confirmed, finally, formally, in words that would exist permanently in his record, that Colonel Julian Ashworth had died in the line of duty, not through failure, not through error, but because he had refused to look away from something he was never supposed to see. Marlowe did not cry during the ceremony. She waited. She waited until the folding chairs had been cleared away and the small crowd had dispersed back into the gray Virginia afternoon, until she stood alone at the edge of the flight line with a small bouquet of white flowers in one hand. And only then did she let herself feel the full weight of 9 years finally, completely, coming to rest. She drove out to the small military cemetery an hour outside base that afternoon, the same one she'd visited exactly twice in 9 years, because visiting more than that had always felt, to some closed-off part of her, like admitting the story was really truly over. Today, for the first time, it was. She knelt at her father's headstone, the granite cool beneath her fingers, and laid the white flowers against the base of it, beside a small American flag that someone Shaw, probably, though she never asked, had already placed there that morning. "I found him, Dad," she said quietly, her voice steady in a way it hadn't been in 9 years. "The man who took you from me. It took 9 years, but I found him." The wind moved through the rows of white headstones, carrying the faint, distant sound of a flag somewhere flapping against its pole, and Marlowe closed her eyes, and for just a moment let herself remember him the way she'd known him. Before all of this, not the classified file, not the redacted transcript, not the flat, official 3 sentences on government letterhead, but her father, laughing, standing in front of an aircraft he loved more than almost anything, utterly certain, in the photograph that still lived in the small metal box beside her bed, that he would live forever. "You did," she whispered. "You do. Every time I fly." Footsteps approached across the grass behind her, slow and respectful, and she didn't need to turn to know who it was. Dax stopped a few feet back, giving her the space the moment required, and waited until she rose to her feet before he spoke. "I didn't want you driving back alone," he said simply. "I could have managed. I know." A small, tired smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I wanted to be here anyway." She looked at him for a long moment, the man who had walked into a briefing room 3 weeks ago believing, with total, unshakable confidence, that he already understood everything worth knowing about who he was, and found, standing in front of her now, someone entirely different, someone quieter, someone who had learned, the hard way, exactly how much of what he thought he knew had needed to be unlearned first. "You've changed," she said. "You did that. You did most of it yourself." She allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, a real smile, small and a little worn at the edges, but real. "I just gave you the simulator dome to break in. 11 times, he said. "I still have nightmares about that stall maneuver." "Good," she said. "It kept you alive." They stood together for a while longer at the edge of the cemetery, the autumn light slanting long and gold across the rows of white stone, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence with anything more than what it already held. "What happens now?" Dax asked eventually. "For you, I mean. The investigation's closed. Kessler's gone. Your father's records corrected." He hesitated. "You spent 9 years chasing this. What do you chase next?" Marlowe considered the question for a long moment, looking out over the quiet rows of headstones, feeling, for the first time in 9 years, the particular lightness of a person no longer carrying a question she couldn't answer. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "I've never let myself think past this moment. Not once, in 9 years. She glanced sideways at him. "Maybe that's the first honest answer I've given anyone in longer than I can remember." "Then here's a suggestion," Dax said. "Not as your wingman, just as whatever I am to you now." "And what's that?" "I'm still working on the word." A ghost of his old smile flickered across his face. Warmer now, less armor and more truth. "But whatever it is. My suggestion is you let yourself have a life that isn't only built around what you lost." Marlowe was quiet for a long moment, the wind moving softly through the grass around them, carrying with it the faint, clean scent of autumn and distant jet fuel, and something that felt for the first time in 9 years, almost like peace. "I'd like that," she said finally. "I think I'd like that very much." They walked back toward the car together, side by side, unhurried, the gray Virginia sky finally breaking open above them into thin bands of late afternoon light, and behind them, at the edge of a quiet military cemetery, a white headstone caught the last of the sun and held it, briefly, like something finally fully at rest. 6 months later, the Black Ridge briefing room filled the same way it always did, 30 pilots in dark green flight suits. The low hum of quiet conversation, the particular electric tension of a room, about to hear something that would decide who lived and who didn't in whatever exercise came next. Colonel Shaw stood at the podium, tapping the microphone once, the room falling silent in the same instant it always did. In row 4, dead center, sat a young second lieutenant, fresh out of training, her uniform crisp, her posture just a little too confident for someone who hadn't yet learned what the sky could take from a person who underestimated it. Beside her, in a chair angled slightly toward the aisle, sat Captain Marlowe Ashworth, no longer a stranger in civilian clothes, no longer a rumor whispered in the officers' club, but a name every pilot on that base now knew and respected. In the particular way you respect someone who has survived something you hope you never have to. At the front of the room, reviewing telemetry beside her, sat Dax, First Lieutenant, no longer either. His own quiet promotion earned in the months since a black stretch of Alaskan ocean had taught him more about who he wanted to be than 4 years at flight school ever had. Colonel Shaw advanced the first slide and began, as he always did, with the scenario, a nightmare of thermal blooms and closing missiles and split-second decisions that would decide, in the space of a few brutal seconds, exactly who walked away. The young lieutenant in row 4 leaned forward, eager, certain, her hand half raised before Shaw had even finished the question. Marlowe watched her for a moment, and something in her chest, old grief, worn smooth now at the edges, folded gently around something that finally, after everything, felt like hope settled quietly into place. Someday, she thought, she'll learn the same lesson I did. That confidence isn't the same as skill, that the sky doesn't care how sure you are, that the only thing that keeps you alive up there is respect for the physics, for the enemy, and for the people who taught you the hard way, so you wouldn't have to learn it alone. I hope, when her moment comes, someone's there to catch her the way I was caught. Beside her, Dax caught her eye across the room, and in the small, private smile that passed between them, Marlowe found something she had spent 9 long years believing she would never fully have again. Not an ending. Something better. A beginning, built carefully out of the wreckage of everything that came before it, steady and hard-won, and entirely, finally, her own.